Chapter 143 In Love, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu sprawled flat on the floor, his torso in Antony's lap, his face buried in Antony's cool, bandaged chest, and tried to keep his mind from flying into 100 pieces. Antony is in love with me. That thought made him want to shriek and squeal and pick his god up and spin him and shout the news to everyone on the ship, everyone in the world. Somebody loved him. It was staggering. Hanyu was the one who loved, who turned foolish with adoration around his friends and favorite priests and eventually his master. He was not loved in return. Father Roichi had been the first to compliment Hanyu's reading when the cadre was about 8. He'd said that Hanyu had a gift, and after that, Hanyu had followed the man around every chance he got. When the boys were playing and the priest walked by, Hanyu would shout and wave at him. He tried to engage Father Roichi in conversation and showered him in pictures, flowers, and the feathers and interesting rocks he found in the courtyard. When he jumped to his feet during a lesson to hug Father Roichi, the priest had finally lost patience and paddled him severely in front of the class for demanding undue attention. Since that day, paddles had been the implement Hanyu hated most, even though others were undeniably more painful. An offering does not call attention to himself. He is quiet until summoned and obedient when called upon. What use is a noisy, demanding slave? Apologize to your cadre for disgracing them, Hanyu. But then, what was it Antony had said? Hanyu, you matter so much more than your obedience. I don't care what use you are. There had been a boy from an older cadre who Hanyu had admired as well, because he laughed once when Hanyu had made an elaborate joke of pretending to fall out of a tree. He'd even let Hanyu follow him around for a few weeks, prattling happily, but the older boy always started conversations with other people in the middle of Hanyu's sentences. Finally, he shooed him away. Gods, don't you ever shut up! Go bother somebody else! I love your talking. Other memories cascaded through his mind, intercut with Antony's constant, bewildering comments. You're meant to serve the gods. Do you think they'll tolerate a whiny slave who's always asking for too much? You've never asked anything of me that I wasn't willing to give. I'd give more if I could. If I could just make you happy, Hanyu, I'd give anything. 30 years I've served here, and you are by far the worst offering I've ever tried to train. Choosing you was the biggest stroke of luck I've had in centuries. What's wrong with you? There isn't a single thing wrong with you. Antony had said so many wonderful, incredible things that went against everything Hanyu knew to be true about himself. But none felt as strange or incomprehensible as this latest statement, the announcement that Antony loved him. How could I be loved by a god after huge mistakes when I couldn't even earn love from humans because of smaller errors? Well, perhaps that wasn't true. He was almost sure that Asao and Kenta loved him, but they never said it. No one had ever said that they loved him before, except for the time when Antony had punished him with the words. But then, that hadn't been a taunt or a punishment at all, had it? He'd been trying to confess his feelings, and Hanyu hadn't understood at all. Poor Antony. And this wasn't a friendly or familial love. Hanyu was almost certain of that, given the way his master was cradling him, the way he'd pressed feverish kisses onto the top of Hanyu's head. Those kisses, Hanyu had thought he would never feel his master's lips anywhere but his throat ever again, and though he could barely feel the touches through his hair, there was still a haste and a clumsiness to the kisses that made them feel dizzyingly passionate. Kisses, 6 of them, so quick and gentle, not carnal, but just affectionate, loving. Antony loved him. Well, not the way Hanyu loved him. That would be ridiculous. Antony was his god, his whole reason for living. But maybe Antony loved him like masters in books loved their treasured concubines, tender and protective, and well pleased with their most prized possessions. Those stories were always about human masters, though. Who would believe that a god would actually... Antony is in love with me. That was dizzying enough. Turn the thought just slightly, though, and everything changed. A god loves me. It was a demented idea. Instead of hugs and squeals, looking at it this way made him want to fall at his master's feet and worship him, overcome with awe and gratitude for the unbelievable honor he'd bestowed on Hanyu. Hanyu, the temple's worst, the scatterbrained, noisy, disobedient boy who had been told 1,000 times that he would never be worthy of serving a god. Could he truly be a god's beloved? Beloved, stupid, useless Hanyu, beloved, me, beloved. Gods, he wanted it so badly. At the thought of having his master's love, it was like an empty pit the size of the ocean opened up inside him. How could it possibly be true when he wanted it this much? Who would believe such a thing? Hanyu tried to imagine standing in front of Father Shu and telling him, "Lord Antony is in love with me." Even saying the words in his own head, while Antony cradled him, it felt like he was lying. He could imagine the priest's reaction all too easily. Disbelief, irritation, righteous anger at his brazenness in telling such a blasphemous lie. Nobody would believe it. Not a sow, not my other friends, definitely not the priests. But I believe it. Hanyu hardly knew why he dared to put his trust in something so fantastical. Antony was a beautiful, powerful, immortal god. He could have absolutely anybody he wanted. Hanyu knew that anyone, god or offering, would be thrilled to be Antony's. There was no reason in the world why he should choose a barely adequate slave to love. But here he was, his arms clutching Hanyu tightly, and, well, now that Hanyu thought about it, his grip had loosened quite a bit. Was everything all right? "Antony?" he whispered, daring to squirm a little in his master's embrace. Antony jolted. "Sorry, yes?" The god's voice was thick and muzzy. He'd been dozing off, Hanyu realized. Was he boring his master? Had he done something wrong? Had he made Antony change his mind? Surely if the god had been sincere about loving him, he wouldn't be so uninterested as to sleep right now. Hanyu's pulse leapt nervously until he remembered how weak Antony still was. His master must have been exhausted from going to the infirmary and back, as well as from dealing with Hanyu's misunderstanding and, oh gods, Lord Titus! Antony had mentioned sitting with his catatonic brother, but Hanyu had been so caught up in his own terror and memories, he hadn't really listened. He'd been focused on surviving Lord Antony, the menacing, all-powerful master who held his life in his hands and who Hanyu had offended. He hadn't been paying any attention to Antony, the beautiful, special, tired person who, if he remembered correctly, had had dried tears on his face before he had even stepped into the bedroom. He sat with his brother, the sick brother he hasn't even been able to visit because I got him hurt. He must have been so sad and exhausted, and I chose that moment to throw myself at him? Oh gods, what's the matter with me? Antony? He pulled back again, resulting in another jolt from his dozing master. When Hanyu knelt up, sore from all the time he'd spent on the floor, he saw that he'd been right. Antony looked wrecked. His face was covered with dried tears, and he seemed dazed and half asleep, though he kept his hands on Hanyu's shoulders as though he might try to run off. The sight of his obvious exhaustion sent a tender pang right through Hanyu. He was this tired, but he sat on the floor and talked with me. Helped me, held me. He could have just sent me away and gone to bed, but he didn't. He took care of me because he loves me? The thought still felt strange and unwieldy in his mind, but there was no time to untangle it. He needed to put his poor master to bed. "What's wrong?" Antony's voice was slurred with sleepiness, but his eyes narrowed when he saw Hanyu's frown. "Nothing." He was still so concerned for his foolish attendant's well-being. Impulsively, Hanyu tilted his head to press a kiss to the hand that still held his shoulder. Antony jumped at the touch, his eyes widening adorably. "But I'm a little tired. Could we go to bed now, Antony?" His master scowled, and it was all Hanyu could do not to lean in and kiss his furrowed forehead. "We don't have to. If there's more we need to talk about, I can stay awake as long as you want." There was so much that Hanyu needed to talk about, but Antony clearly needed a rest. He got to his feet and held his hands out to help his glowering god up as well. "I can manage," Antony grumbled, averting his eyes and getting the stubborn look that he wore when he felt like a burden. "Yes, but I can help you," said Hanyu. "Please, Antony?" The god huffed, but he let Hanyu pull him to his feet. The few steps he took towards the bed were stiff and halting. Hanyu wanted to sweep him into his arms and carry him, wanted to do anything at all to help smooth the lines of pain from his face as he moved, but he managed to restrain himself. "I love you. And can it be true? Do you really love me?" Once Antony was sitting on the edge of the bed, Hanyu expected him to start undressing himself. Not that he was still wearing all that many clothes after draping his shirt over Hanyu's shoulders. Instead, the god lowered himself down gingerly and curled onto his side. He still wasn't quite able to coil his body into his usual tight ball, but at least he could bend a little now. He's not even fussing about the sheets. He really must be worn out. It was surprisingly retching for Hanyu to pull himself away from the sight. It felt somehow as though the miracle would end if he stepped away, as though Antony, or his incredible, undeserved love, would simply vanish. But Hanyu had to piss and wash up for bed. He leaned down and pressed a few more quick, fervent kisses over the chilly skin of his master's fingers before reluctantly turning towards the washroom, praying that the dream would last a little longer. He stared at himself in the mirror as he washed. It was not a sight that explained anything. He was red-eyed and tear-stained, his face puffy from all his weeping. He wasn't even wearing any makeup. He looked like a tired temple servant, not even an offering, much less an offering who could possibly have earned a god's love. In the stories, beloved slaves were always the most beautiful and obedient. He was clearly neither. How could it be true? What had his master even managed to find lovable about him that no one else ever had? Your kindness, your generosity, your curiosity, your smile. Fuck, I'm addicted to your smile. Hanyu flushed just remembering those words, his heart pounding so hard it seemed like it was trying to escape his chest. But what did it mean? Kindness? Hanyu had not been kind to Antony, using his dead husband and lover as weapons in a fight, running off in a snit when the god was distracted with his ailing brother. Hell, even today making him sit and comfort his useless slave instead of getting the rest he badly needed. Generosity? How could Hanyu be generous with the person who already owned him? All his time and energy already belonged to Antony, so anything he could give would just be offering up his master's dues. Curiosity? That had always been a bad habit of his, a trait that made him loud and annoying and insufficiently submissive. So how could it be endearing? His smile? Well, he supposed there wasn't much arguing with that one. If the sight of his smile pleased his god, then that was good to know. I have to figure out what it is about me that endears me to him. If I can understand that, I'll know how to keep the miracle. That niggling fear returned, that somehow it would all already be over when he came back to the bedroom. The dream of his master's love ending as inexplicably as it had begun. But when Hanyu got back from the washroom, Antony was still there, fast asleep on the bed. Am I allowed to get in bed with him? I'm still in disgrace, and he didn't give me permission before falling asleep. Maybe I shouldn't risk it. Maybe I should go to the couch. But he loves me. A beloved slave is allowed in the bed, right? It still didn't feel real. He knew he'd heard the words, but, well, his mind was in such a flurry, there was no way he would be able to fall asleep. He would keep thinking about it after sliding into bed with Antony. Hanyu curled around his master's chilly, breathless body. It was so good. He hadn't dared to cuddle his god since the island, at least not while he was awake. The familiar shape pressed against him filled an aching absence that he hadn't even realized had been there these last few days. Blissful now, he shut his eyes and settled in to untangle his confusing life. When he opened his eyes again, Hanyu found that he'd sprawled over the bed, and his head was somehow down at the foot while his legs were up among the pillows. The sheets were wrapped around him, and his left foot was pressing into a shape that was soft, but too firm to be a pillow. He propped himself up to look. Antony was squeezed onto the edge of the mattress, Hanyu's foot digging into his stomach, and he was staring at his offering with a soft, scared look on his face that Hanyu couldn't even begin to interpret. He's rested now, or at least he's tried. I'm sure my flailing didn't help with that. Has he reconsidered? Does he still... Sorry! Hanyu pulled his foot away and sat up. Antony sat up as well, scowling, and the dear, familiar expression soothed Hanyu's jangling nerves just a little. It's fine. I knew what I was getting into when I got into bed with you, though I don't think I've ever seen you turn all the way upside down before. That took some doing. Well, you never actually came to bed with me, Hanyu murmured, feeling strangely shy. You were asleep, so I never got permission. You don't need permission to sleep in your own damn bed, the god snapped. That was just like him, to glare and growl as he said the most amazing things. Of course it wasn't Hanyu's bed. Even the cot had not belonged to him, not really. Everything in these rooms belonged entirely to Antony, Hanyu included, but he always behaved as though his subpar slave had every right to use the space as he pleased. He's so good to me. For him to say that he loved me, on top of that, even if he never said it again. Some of Hanyu's nervousness dissipated in a wave of fondness. He gazed at his master, addled with adoration. I love you, he blurted. Antony startled, shooting Hanyu a quick, nervous look. Oh, really? Still? What does that mean? How could he possibly doubt it? Antony! Shocked, Hanyu crawled up to join his master at the head of the bed. Of course! I've loved you for ages! Ages? The god raised an eyebrow. Hanyu rolled his eyes and huffed. All right, fine. A month and a half? 2 months? I see. Antony's lips twitched up in a way that would have been infuriating if Hanyu hadn't been so desperately in love with him at the moment. Ages. And you meant it too? Hanyu was fairly sure of the answer, but his stomach still felt like it was full of live, wriggling fish. Antony glowered. Of course I meant it. You're incredible. You didn't leave me much choice but to love you. He sounded so put out about it, Hanyu couldn't restrain a giggle. He barely managed to keep from grabbing his master in a hug, remembering that he was likely still sore from his injuries. Instead, Hanyu wrapped his arms around himself and squeezed, certain that that was the only way to keep his body from exploding with the sheer amount of all that he felt for this perfect, cantankerous man. I love you, he breathed. I love you, I love you. Antony ducked his head, hiding his face. I heard you the first time. I can't help it, cried Han Yu. He leaned forward, still clutching himself, and peppered fervent, joyful kisses on his master's knees and thighs, anywhere he could reach. I've stopped myself from saying it so many times. Now I just have to let it out. I love you, Antony. We'll talk more today. Maybe he'll even be kind enough to explain exactly what he means when he says it to me. But for now, just to be able to say it aloud at last, that's more than enough.